Okay, so now that we've introduced you to the process of course design and we've talked a little bit about selecting course goals, which is I think one of the hardest tasks, we can now talk about designing the activities and assignments in your class. For your particular case, it'll be mostly activities for your club. And the goal is to connect those activities quite explicitly to your course goals. Or as we say in the education literature, we want you to align your activities with your course goals. And so that's what we'll want to think about in this section. So again, there are kind of three purposes, which I mentioned in the goals section, or in the course design section. There are kind of three purposes to an activity that you might have in your course. The first purpose would be to display knowledge of your goal. So you want them to be able to display curiosity. So you might think of an activity that allows them to display that curiosity, or that allows them to display knowledge of batteries, right? You might think of some activity that lets them show you that they know it. And this doesn't necessarily have to be an end of the semester thing. It can also be things throughout the week, right? Or end of the week thing, but it can be throughout the week as well. But you might also have activities that are designed to help them practice the skills they need in order to display that curiosity or to display their knowledge of batteries. But then you also might have activities that are designed to help them to discover things, whether that's content knowledge. You might actually, instead of just lecturing on something, you might give them an activity where they learn about it through an activity. Or maybe to discover the exciting aspects of science, right? Or discover ethical dilemmas along those lines. So those are the three purposes. So we should think then, what questions should you ask yourself when you're thinking about designing activities for the purpose of displaying knowledge? You might ask, what evidence would you need to see to know that students had successfully met your goals? So you figured out what your goals are, but what does that look like? Right? What would it look like? You know, we said 2 to 3 years down the line, they've shown that they look different than the students who haven't succeeded. So what would that look like? But then you have to think, okay, I have a sense in my mind of what that looks like, but what assignment would I give them, or what activity would they do so they can show it to me, right? So they can display it. And then you're going to have these final projects at the end of the week in the clubs. So one thing you might ask yourself is, how can I encourage my students to display the things that I care about in that final presentation and project? Because they might do a lot of different things, but you could try to nudge them in the direction of displaying the curiosity or displaying their knowledge of batteries, right? Instead of giving them as like complete freedom to do whatever they want to do. And then finally, you need to be prepared if you do these types of activities where they can display their knowledge to you. What if they display that they're not learning, right? What if they display that they're not curious about science? What if they display that they don't understand batteries, right? What do you do in that situation, and how do you respond, right? Because the purpose of these activities is so you can see whether your students are learning, and so the program can see as well. For practice activities, these are the questions you want to ask. Which outcomes do they need to practice? And I'm going to tell you, all of them need to be practiced. Anything that you want your students to be able to do, they should practice. We oftentimes in traditional course design will just give our students one opportunity to display what we want them to learn. We say, you need to learn this, and now I'm going to give you a test once. But giving them the opportunity to practice the things you want them to do is especially important. You should think about what activities you can assign that will allow students to practice the skills they'll display in their final projects. And then you should think about, are there component skills? Are there smaller skills that they need to learn and need to practice in order to do the larger goals that you have in your class? And then finally, the discovering purpose activities, which are really interesting and complicated and take maybe a little bit more time to think about, but are also really valuable. And here you're going to think about which of your outcomes, which of your goals, do you hope to introduce via hands-on activity? And then you need to think about, how is that activity actually going to teach them that thing? How will it do it? You know, you could just think it's just magic, right? But you should try to think about, why is this activity going to help them understand the relationship between these two concepts? And then you should also think, well, why is this better than just telling them, right? Oftentimes doing hands-on activity is absolutely better than direct instruction, right? Just explaining it to them. But sometimes there may be more or less effective, and maybe you want a balance between hands-on activities and a few sort of introducing some reading materials, or introducing, a maybe 2-minute lecture about something instead of having them do an activity. So those are things you should be thinking about as you're designing your discovery-based activities. So that now concludes our portion on the theory of designing your activities, and we're now moved on to an activity about activities.